Ahila Gatanya, and we're at the part where we're speaking about God's unity. So it's a bit of a philosophical section, and there's very few things more important in the world to know that God is one. Because once you really know that, everything changes. Everything. Because I start to live within a reality that there's nothing but you, Hashem, there's nothing but God. Now, the one thing we're going to have to talk about is that if God is one, then what's all this stuff around? Oneness seems to necessitate that there's no other. Now, we're going to have to explain that. The answer is going to be, we have a Kabbalistic answer to that question. That will take us time, though, to develop. But what we're doing now, and this is all coming off the topic of the Tanya that we spoke about, which is where does the godly soul come from? So we mentioned that it comes conceptually from God's mind, and he, so to speak, inseminated that, and the mind of Hashem, just like the mind, the seed of the child comes from the mind of the father, so too the seed of the soul, the godly soul, comes from, so to speak, God's mind. But now what we're going to do is to understand how God's mind is unified with him more than it is with us. So let's read those words inside. Elahu v'chachmasai echad. Hashem and his wisdom are all one. Okay, Hashem and his thoughts, let's call it, are one. Kamoisha kosav a Rambam, we're learning a Rambam now. Shehu hamada, God is the power to know. V'hu hayodeya, God is the knower. V'hu hayediya, and he's the subject of knowledge. And this idea is not something that we could fully grasp. I want to read you inside the Rambam something to just bring this a little bit closer to home in the parish. It says here in the Rambam, I suggest people look up this Rambam. It's in Yesodei HaTorah Perek Beis. It's going on Halacha Yud, where the Rambam says like this. The parish is quoting it. How does this work that God, his unity, is not like ours? Okay? We don't have the ability to fully understand how God is one. Let's just go into this fully, which means that we can understand it somewhat, and we have to plunge into that as much as we can. Let me give you an example of the way that we think and the way that we work. This is going to be very practical now, okay? You ready? When a person starts thinking and thinks about an item, give me any item. Pick an item, any item. Let's go. Donnie, pick an item. Anything. A calculator? Beautiful. Excellent. I like that choice. So, calculator. You have that, the picture in your mind of what a calculator is, the shape of it, what it looks like. You think about calculator. So he mentions here that you think about maybe the Suras Hakise, the shape of a chair. You picture a chair, or a habayis, or a house, some type of maybe a planet, something, some concept, something, maybe a tree. So how do I grasp that thought? Let's go back to calculator. What he says. In the beginning, you know what a calculator is in potential. Meaning, before I even tell you calculator, do you have the ability to know calculator? Mm-hmm. You have a power inside of you called the ability to know calculator? Mm-hmm. Excellent, you do. Which means even before Daniel Chaim says calculator, you have the ability in you, the power invested in you to know of a concept called calculator, just like you have the ability to know a chair or a house or a planet, etc. You have that power, okay? But loy bepoil. But it's not, you're not using that yet. You're not using the power called knowing calculator until I say calculator. Before that, it's in potential. I have the potential of this power. We're going to see what this means. This is called mada, the power to know things. In your brain, you have the power to know things. Pay attention. But before I say calculator, loy nichkazu hatsur b'machshavtoi. The image of calculator is not yet emblazoned. It's not yet carved into your consciousness. Okay? You have the power to have it carved into your consciousness. Because I say, don't think about a pink elephant. So before I said that, you have the power to know a pink elephant. But now it's probably a little bit more in your consciousness of this funny pink element, this funny pink elephant that you're all thinking about. When you actually start thinking about a pink elephant, or back to the calculator, as soon as you start thinking about calculator, now you start dissecting it, thinking about it. How many buttons does it have in the calculator? Is it a calculus one? Is it one of those, what do they call the fancy ones?
Graphic calculator.
A graph? TIA4. Version 2. Point whatever. That one. And you start thinking about it and you start dissecting it. Which means, before I mentioned T4, what is it? T41. TI-84. Oh, that's the one? The Texas Instrument Calculator. Before I talk about that, you have the ability to know it. As soon as I say it, it carves into your brain, and then it becomes known to you. That's called yudua. It becomes, or yediyah. It becomes known. I know this thing now. Okay? Now it's known to me. And I could develop that yediyah. I could develop that subject of knowledge deeper and deeper, carving it more into my consciousness as I develop it. As I turn it over in my head, as I take the calculator and flip directions, I see, is it broken on the back? I see, is it working properly? Does it have a solar panel at the top? I'm investigating it. I start putting in equations. It's carving deeper into my consciousness. Says the Parish, Hari lecha shloisha devarim. I've mentioned to you 3 things in the process of you obtaining knowledge and information. What are those 3 things? Ha'adam, the man himself, who is the yoideya. You're the knower. You can know things. You are what's called it, not that you can know, you are the knower of things. That's number 1. 2, tsuras hakise, or let's call it tsuras hakalculator. The image of the calculator, that's now kind of carved itself into your brain. It's not you. There's you, the guy who can know things. There's the calculator, which has now been carved into your consciousness. Vehadas sheba yoda zuhatsura. And the das, or the mada, which is the power invested in you to know anything. That was what we mentioned before I said calculator, that you have the ability to know calculators. And that ability is not even you. Okay, you see the 3 things here? You have you, the knower, and you, the knower, are the one who can know about calculators, etc. You have the calculator. This is this new concept that's becoming carved into your consciousness. And now you have the ability to know things. When it comes to man, woman, humanity, those are 3 separate ideas. When it comes to God, okay, pay attention, this is where it gets deep. God is God. Creation is, of course, the subject of the knowledge. And Hashem's ability to know creation is all one. Put that one in your pipe and smoke it. Can you fully grasp that? The answer is we can't fully, but we could give it a good shot. And a good part of the mitzvah, which is a constant mitzvah, of thinking about Hashem's unity revolves around thinking about that Hashem is one, and that in this perspective, Hashem's oneness is unique, is not like any other oneness in the world. Now let's develop that idea a little bit more. So we explained the Rambam, we explained how the Baal HaTanya is explaining how God, His knowledge, and His ability to know things are all one thing. And therefore, when we talk about God's mind, don't forget where we're going with this, which is explaining how the godly soul came from God's mind. Okay, pay attention to that. We explain that as an allegory of that Hashem He seeded the godly soul that's inside of us like a father gives the seed to the child, which is the child, and therefore has the likeness of the father. Hashem, so to speak, gave from his mind, conceptually, of course, there's nothing physical here, the godly soul, but God's mind is so unique in that when we talk about Hashem and his mind, it's one thing. And therefore, our soul, this is very deep, is literally an undiluted element of the oneness of Hashem appearing in us. And therefore you have an undiluted, unified consciousness inside of you of Hashem that is totally one, and that is a chelik elokani mal mamish, like we began the chapter with, literally a undiluted piece, so to speak, a spark of God. And when we talk about God, we mean him in his unified essence. Yes.
How can we have an undiluted piece of something?
Excellent question. We're just using a language that will be l'sabras ha'oizim, that can satisfy the ear, because I have a soul, you have a soul, we all have souls. Mm-hmm. Now, your soul is inside of you. Well, different parts of it. On the higher levels, you're right. All we have is one soul. This is called the level of Yechidah. We'll talk about it later a little bit, which is that all of us are unified at that place. But as you come lower down, right, there's 5 levels of the soul. There's Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chai, Yechid. As you come lower down, the Yechid is connected to the Chai is connected to the Neshama is connected to the Ruach is connected to the Nefesh is connected to the body. So you can actually have a part of that one soul coming in and expressing in your body, There is a famous chazal that a person said that he came into a house and he saw the sun was streaming in his window. And his neighbor says, no, the sun's coming into my window. It must be a different sun. The sun is coming to my window. It's coming to my window. He says, it's the same source. It's the same source beaming down, but is the sun, within that house, is the sun in my house? Does that negate the oneness of the sun? We're actually going to develop this analogy a lot more as we get deeper into the Tanya. This is a famous analogy from the great mystic, the Arizal, which is that our souls are like rays from the sun. And even though it appears to you down here, when you see a ray coming into the room, you're like, hey Ray, how you doing? Sometimes you see it has a little bit of twinkle because of some dust in the room, and you can identify that ray. You see him as something separate, so to speak. And he might look like Ray, I'm going on a date tonight, I'm looking good. I said, you're not, you don't have such an identity like you think. Let me trace you back from whence you came from. Which means, Ray, what do you look like on the surface of the sun? Are you such a big shot over there? You dissolve back into the sun. But from the perspective down here, the ray is something. That ray is like the ray that comes into every one of your bodies. You're that house for the ray, but we trace all the way back to the same source. We're going to develop this analogy more. Yeah, maybe.
How can Hashem be diluted in the first place?
So that the answer to that, he's never actually diluted. It's only from our perspective, and that's what we call tzimtzum, which means that Hashem is covering himself. He's hiding himself, of course, with himself. He's hiding himself with himself. But creating a perspective that he's withdrawn. And you might say, why would he do that? Well, the answer is, if you would want to, let's get back to Mr. Ray. So Ray, going on a date? Yeah, going on a date. Where? Back on the surface of the sun. Well, you or your date would cease to exist. Which means if Hashem didn't sort of conceal, how would we exist? It's only because he creates a perspective. But did Hashem change from before and after creation? Not one iota. Like the prophet says, Ani Hashem lo shamisi. The most important part about learning, especially anything more in the mystical dimension of Torah, we start talking about like Hashem concealing himself and how creation comes to be, is that don't think that creation created anything new in God. All that creation created was a new perspective, which is our perspective. But from God's perspective, there's nothing but God. Our job is to start to trace our way back to the sun, but be aware of it. That's cool. Maybe hot, I don't know, not so cool over there by the sun. That's awesome. You start tracing yourself back to the source of that oneness. Now, I want to just mention something else about oneness. When we talk about God's oneness, like we already mentioned, his oneness is not like our oneness. We have those three different ways of understanding things. Hashem is all one. Him in creation and the ability to know creation, have a relationship with it, is all one. When we talk about one, I could say that I have one pen here. Now you might say, well, I can cut that in two, now there's two. You can cut that in three. Wasn't there some movie where like, some creature, every time you cut it, it like grows a new thing? Worms are like that, right? Every time you cut them, it's just, it just keeps growing more and more. Hydrogen? Hydro. Oh, he was the one. The mythical creature. So there's such a thing in this world. I can keep splicing something smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So when I say there's one, I mean that it's one in relation to the next one. If I say there's one person in the room, am I really one? I'm one until somebody else shows up. When we use one in this world, we refer to it in a sequence. Because it never can be one, because I can always splice it. I have one apple. Well, I can cut that apple. So in this world, one is just the first number of a sequence. But the Zohar says something very profound. If a person davens Sfar, we say it at the beginning of Shabbos, which is, Ant Chad, you are one, v'loi b'cheshbon. But you're not one in a sequence of numbers. Let me say it another way. In the physical world, is one a big number or a small number? Smallest number is the puniest number. You got $1 million? Oh, bummer. One. We talked about this on Shabbos. Only 1 mil. You have 100 million. Okay, making moves. You're going somewhere. Not what it's going to be when Mashiach comes, but at least you're going somewhere. Pretty good. In the world of physicality, one is the smallest number. In the world of spirituality, one is the greatest number. There's no greater number than one, because one means there's nothing else. One means absoluteness. When we talk about Hashem being one, that's the ultimate. It's not one and then, in the category of anything. Like, there's like God and then like a creation.
It's one in the category of one.
One in the category of one. You could say it another way. You should know, we are hardcore monotheists. What's a softcore monotheist? There's one God. In the category of gods, there's one God. But then there's a Pepsi bottle, which I'm not so fond of anyways. There's tables, there's also there's watches, there's plastic. There's all sorts of stuff going on. There's God and his world. That's softcore monotheism. What's hardcore monotheism? There's nothing but God. We're inside of him right now. That's more of a trip. That's hardcore stuff. You don't need LSD for that. Just learn some Torah. You get way higher. That is awesome stuff. There's nothing but God. We're inside of him right now. That is mind-boggling. That's unbelievably deep. So then we have to process that, okay? And there's part of the relationship is to start to feel unified. So to speak, we're all on the surface of the sun. That might be another way to say it. From our perspective, we're like the ray of light down here. But from the true perspective, we're actually on the surface of the sun. And let me ask you a question. Does the ray of light shine also on the sun?
Mm-hmm.
What's your proof?
That's where it comes from.
You're saying good. I would say it maybe like this.
The sun is much brighter than the ray.
Okay, that's also good. Maybe I can say it a kal v'chomer. Let's say that as a kal v'chomer, which is if the ray is shining down here, far from its source, and you see it, then kal v'chomer, it's shining up there, by the source, like you guys were saying. It's mamish a kol shekain. Ben benoy shekol. If it's shining here, then certainly it must be radiating there. So when you start tracing yourself back to that, and we're going to proceed very, one step at a time how we're going to do that, you start to really open up something of what's really going on. You start getting into the good stuff of Torah. Boys, have a wonderful, wonderful week. Looking forward to continue to learn Yesher Koyach. We should be Zohar to know the Torah, the emes on me.
Thank you, Rav.
Thank you, guys.